working with the dairy industry.
Thank you. And Nick?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Nick Richardson. I'm the president and CEO of the Vermont Land Trust, and calling in from our Montpelier office this morning.
Just down the road. And Andrea?
I'm Andrea Papiti. Oh, can you hear me?
Just barely.
I'm Andrea Papiti, and I am the hearing officer for the Public Utility Commission.
And we've also been joined by our legislative counsel, Mike O'Grady, in the room. Welcome, Mike. And Linda Lehman is the staff assistant and probably the most important person in the room. I wanted to start the meeting. Jackie is, oh, good. Jackie, your timing is perfect. I wanted to start the meeting just by acknowledging that Bobby and Jackie were inducted into the State Agricultural Hall of Fame in the last couple of weeks. And so congratulations to them. Congratulations, Senator Starr and Jackie. We just a little bit of housekeeping. We had scheduled the next meeting date for October 10th, which turns out to be Indigenous Peoples Day. So we're moving that meeting to October 11th, and hopefully that won't cause any difficulty.
It's 2 meetings.
2 meetings. 2 meetings. No, that's the next meeting. Oh, no, you're right. We have a meeting the end of September, and then, so that'll be
Right.
I apologize. We have a meeting September 26th will be the next meeting, and then the meeting following that is October 11th. And then Senator Brock, we've had some discussion. The meeting following that is the day before Election Day. And John, so far that hasn't caused difficulty, but we just wanted to make sure that's not a problem for you folks being that close to Election Day.
Well, it is a time of year. I mean, for those of us who are running, it generally is a very busy day. It's the last day in which you are able to get out and have contact with voters. It's a time that always has sine waves and other kinds of things going on. It is not the best time, at least from my perspective, to have a meeting.
Okay, so why don't we have the next few days scheduled out, and why don't we reserve discussion on that one for going forward?
Far enough ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So we have Dr. Wolf from Cornell today taking up the whole meeting to discuss milk pricing. And I just want to take a minute to put his testimony into a little bit of context. Pretty much the last action that the task force took in the last go round was to request a legal opinion about a state milk pricing order to review the legality under the Constitution were the state through the task force to take action to implement a state milk pricing over milk and over order milk price. We spent a fair amount of time trying to, we requested the legal opinion, and we obviously the objective is to have the legal opinion presented to the task force. And we thought that some background for the legal opinion would be helpful first. So the next couple meetings have been scheduled with that in mind. We start today with Dr. Wolf, who is the agricultural economist at Cornell University with a specialty in federal milk market order price regulation, to give us a detailed explanation of how regulated milk prices work under the federal system and how a Vermont dairy farmer gets paid under the federal price regulation, with the federal order program really being literally the underlayment of an over order price. Over order meaning being state action above the order established by the federal price regulation. So obviously, federal milk market order pricing is quite dense and complex, and Dr. Wolf is our guide through the complexity of that. And we thought that appropriate to have him speak for the whole day today with a break in the middle. At one point in my career, I went to a briefing with Governor Kunin, not too different than this. And just after the break, Governor Kunin put her hands over her head and said, I might need another break real soon because you're making my head hurt. So hopefully that won't occur today. The meeting after that is in follow-up to that will be a joint meeting with myself and the law professor that we asked to do the price regulation. I'm going to kind of pull the testimony that we received about how the Vermont dairy industry is configured at this point, and give some description of what a price regulation mechanically would look like. Yes, Randy.
As we go through this, is there a plan to also take some testimony and to do some analysis before taking the testimony on the potential economic impacts to the customers and to the Vermont consumer and to the business customers of dairy, that if, for example, there is a price change that would effectively raise prices, what would that mean economically, and what unforeseen consequences, if you can put it, could result from such a change?
Sure. So the rollout is really, and I think from the beginning, the task force reasonably said if it's not legal, then there's no need to go through the next steps of this. So conceptually, is it legal? The legal opinion comes back that conceptually it is legal. So then to take the rollout forward, let's look at what that would look like in concept, go back through the law and the mechanical economics of doing it. And then the follow-up to that is testimony about what the consequences of doing it might or might not be. So that's you've anticipated, that what comes after in subsequent meetings. So next meeting, just what you're saying, we outline what it looks like, talk about the law of it, and then in the following meetings, in addition to the economics of consumers and processors and businesses, we also want to talk about environmental impacts in addition. And as we talked about earlier on, at a follow-up meeting, we will begin to analyze how to incorporate the costs of economic performance on the farm into milk price regulation. What would that look like? So that's both a kind of a rollout of what's coming, and also to set the table for Dr. Wolf's testimony. And unless there are any further questions from task force members, I turn over I'm turning over the camera to Dr. Wolf.
All right. Thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody for having me here this morning. I'm going to share my slides here, which you would think I would be good at since I've been doing this for 3 years. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. I'll bet you all were super excited when you got up this morning and you thought to yourself, 2.5 hours of listening to how milk is priced. That is just,
Chris, I think this group actually is excited.
okay, well, good. So, all right, let me just briefly, I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin, went to University of Wisconsin, then I went to UC Davis for graduate school. Then I spent 22 years as faculty member at Michigan State in the Ag Econ department before I came to Cornell a little over 3 years ago. So I have kind of, been in the upper Midwest in a couple states, been in California, and did some work on the California state order when I was in graduate school out there. It's changed a little bit since then, in the sense that now it's federal order, and we'll talk about that. So I've kind of, I like to think seen some different perspectives, and until 3 years ago, hadn't really spent much time in the Northeast, but now I have, and it's been a pleasure getting to know the Northeast, and I'm happy to talk to you today. Cornell University has offered a class on dairy markets and policy for about 100 years. And I have been teaching it for the last 3 years. And before that, it was Andy Davakovich, which some of you may know. And actually, to be fair, I'm also borrowing some of these slides that I've modified from Andy's. And actually, as a side note, one of the kind of battles that I'm having right now at Cornell is to convince them to keep offering that class. So maybe we will. But my job as I see it today is to tell you kind of how do farmers get paid for milk. And that involves an understanding of federal milk marketing orders for most farms. And even the farms that aren't in federal milk marketing orders are heavily affected by them. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that as we go along. If there are questions, I'm happy, especially if they're clarifying questions, I'm happy to take them as we go. And if, it's something I'm going to hit on soon, I'll just tell you that, or, but I'm happy to clarify. So don't be afraid to speak up. And I understand we're going to take a break at about 10:30 is my understanding. So we'll see where we're at that point. So this is my kind of outline of where I'm heading here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about history, kind of how did we end up with federal milk marketing orders. And I'm going to talk about the two main functions they provide, which is classified pricing and revenue pooling. I'm going to talk some about the Northeast order as far as what's been going on there and a little bit about Vermont. And then I'm going to get into some of the state policies that are built around or on, depending on the case, the federal milk marketing orders, and especially a couple of them that are in the Northeast part of the United States. So when it comes to marketing milk, if you look around the world, you'll see that it's heavily regulated most places. And that's kind of not an accident. It's also, by the way, dairy markets and the policy aspects are what holds up most of our free trade agreements anymore. And not just for us, the Europeans, when they're working on new free trade agreements, which they've been doing at a much faster rate than we have in the last decade. A lot of it is about dairy industry, and with them, it's about getting into things like protecting their names and stuff that they want everybody to recognize. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But there's a reason that dairy policy is kind of so complicated, and why it's kind of been so protected in many ways and so unique. And a lot of that has to do with the challenges of milk production and with marketing milk, which then ties back into the history. So, as you know, right, milk gets harvested daily, 2 or 3 times a day, depending. So we're pricing a flow rather than a given lot. Now there's other crops where we have a flow, eggs comes readily to mind, but eggs doesn't have all of these other characteristics. Milk is very highly perishable on the farm, right? So it's got to be shipped at least every other day. Eggs, for example, would be a little bit different there. You might have a little leeway. There are lots of other crops that once you harvest them, they need to be marketed quickly, but you probably have some leeway in as far as when you harvest them, or at least a little bit of leeway. Milk is mostly water as it comes from the cow and as it leaves the farm. So it's expensive to transport in any reasonable distance, at least in that form. And then you've got production variation from day to day and seasonally, depending on where in the lactation the cattle are, depending on the weather, depending on nutrition, depending on lots of other factors. So that you have to deal with. And then you've got the marketing variation too. So for example, in Michigan, where I came from, on a Tuesday, sometimes 75 to 80% of the milk that was produced in Michigan was going into the bottle. And then on a Saturday, it was usually more like 15 or 20%. So somebody's got to be able to handle that kind of variation from day to day. And then finally, there's a large amount of asset fixity, not just at the farm level, but at the co-op and processor level also, which is to say that the production facilities are very specific to milk production, and they have little use and therefore little salvage value outside of dairy farming. That tends to leave these factors of production in their current use, even when maybe it's not the best return at the current time. And so that has specific implications for the supply response, which is to say that once you give it up, you're unlikely to go back. And once you've made those investments, you're going to use them, right? And we even see that at the processor level too. When a big new cheese plant comes online, and especially the new ones that they're building today that cost $500 or $600 million. There's one going up right now in Texas. There's one that came online a couple of years ago in Michigan. And once you put that kind of money into it for that purpose, you're going to fill it. You're going to see that it's filled. And that's actually having market implications at the current time, because we are a little short on butter and cream in this country. And part of the reason for that nationally is because a couple of big cheese plants have soaked up a lot of that. That would otherwise have gone to the churn. Oh, I've got a little bit of, I keep meaning to undo the.
So Chris, does that affect, that must affect the price, doesn't it? With the milk going to the cheese plant? And,
Yes.
and so is that why we're seeing an uptick in the price right now? Or?
Yeah, that's having implications kind of both ways, right? Which is, but primarily that's the reason why class 4, which is milk that goes to butter and non-fat dry milk, is $4 a hundredweight, is 20% higher than class 3 right now. Class 3 is also high compared to historic terms in the sense that it's about $20 a hundredweight. Although once we factor in the income over feed cost, doesn't look nearly as good, right? Because if any of you are living in cash markets for any feed products right now, you understand that $20 a hundredweight is not making you money. But yeah, that's driving the difference, is that and also to the extent that they keep building cheese plants like that in Texas. And let's be clear, those are big commodity cheese plants, okay? Those are plants that are intended for, a lot of them are aimed more at export markets. And making barrels of cheese, that some of which are going to do things like end up being made into Velveeta and Cheese Whiz and stuff like that. This is not high margin, high quality cheddar that you're going to go, specifically to the store to have that way. But it does have implications also longer term in terms of the market, because we are going to, as a side note, need to export more cheese in the future. Because the cheese production capacity that's coming online in those processing plants is going to be more than what we're going to be eating here. So we're going to see more cheese exports, almost certainly. So, the good question. So anyways, as I was saying, if we look at milk, and this, by the way, this graphic here, I need to update it because well, frankly, 3.65 butterfat is where we were 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But today, the average amount of butterfat that's produced is a little over 4%. And it varies. It varies by region. It varies by breed. It varies with nutrition on the herd, right, and all that kind of stuff. But we actually finished 2021 nationally with the milk marketed right at 4.0% butterfat. And this year we're on pace for it to be like 4.05. And part of that is what we were actually just talking about, which is we've been short on butter. Not just for butter itself, but for cream and ice cream has been tight nationally. And so because of that, those prices have been higher for that component, which is butterfat, which we'll get into how it's priced. And the farmers have, responded correctly to that, and they have greatly increased both genetically and through nutrition, the amount of butterfat that they're producing. So, but anyway, we're talking a product that's 88% water as it leaves the cow, 3.5% protein, 4.7% lactose. It's got some minerals and butterfat, right? But the other thing that's important here is that nobody, except by accident, or if they drink it out of the bulk tank, drinks milk in the form that it leaves the cow. Okay. We used to drink out of the bulk tank when I was a kid. I don't think you're supposed to do that, but it's pretty common. And, but otherwise, even if you're going to the store to buy whole milk, right? You don't buy whole milk at the store that's 4% butterfat, unless there's some, special deal that you've got going on. Right. So whole milk is 3.25% butterfat. So even if we just take this milk that I've got on the screen here, and we're going to make whole milk out of it, they're going to skim that 0.4% of butterfat off because it's worth something, right? They're going to do something else with it. They're going to make butter. They're going to make cream. They're going to do something else with it. So, nobody consumes it as it leaves the cow. So that's kind of except by accident. So that's a complicating factor also when it comes time to price it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit of history. So during the 1800s, a supply chain began to develop for kind of as we moved from lots of people being on farms and having a couple cows on the farm to produce their milk for themselves, for their own butter and cream and cheese consumption, right? And there started to be more farms that were commercially, as their core business to sell milk, right? And most of this really happened in the northeast part of the United States because Boston was the biggest city in the country for a very long time, right? So a lot of it had to do with farms that were growing up enough to serve the Boston market, which was, the first kind of city. And when it came time to purchasing milk from the farmers, especially around the Boston milk shed, the processors had a competitive advantage because, there was one of them buying from many different farms. They knew how much they needed. They knew what it was selling for to the customer. The farmers didn't know that. And they also knew that the farms had to sell the milk or find some other use for it very quickly, right? So you could make take it or leave it offers. And, the only recourse that farms had was maybe to dump it or try to find something else to do with it. If you're milking cows, it was difficult at that time to also be running, your own cheese plant or something like that. So there was definitely an asymmetry in bargaining power and information that went with it. So that resulted in dairy farmers organizing the co-ops to take care of the marketing of their milk, right? So that was kind of the first thing that happened was farmers organized into co-ops. And these co-ops in the Boston order actually developed what we call classified pricing in the late 1800s, where classified pricing means selling the milk at different prices based on what it was going to be eventually used for. Okay, so they recognized that the demand for milk is different for beverage milk than it is for milk that's going to be used for cheese or butter, as far as what an economist would call demand elasticity, how much slope you have on the demand curve. And something that has a more inelastic demand or less elastic demand, you can charge a higher price for, and you will sell a little bit less, but your revenue will go up by more than the amount that your quantity sold goes down, so you'll have higher revenues. Okay, and the co-ops recognize this, and they introduced classified pricing to capture some of the slope on those demand curves. Co-ops also had to deal with the seasonal mismatches between supply and demand. And we still have some seasonality in milk production today, in the sense that nationally in the spring flush in May and June, we're going to have about 6% more milk, 5 or 6% more milk than we do in like December, January, when we hit the low point. And for that reason, by the way, right, we have to produce cheese and butter during the spring flush so that we have enough for the holiday seasons, right? So butter is storable for long term. Cheddar cheese gets better when you store it. Mozzarella doesn't, but still we need to produce milk, and the co-ops recognize that, and the co-ops were a way of dealing with that. And part of the way they dealt with that was to pay farmers a little bit more to change to encourage changing their calving patterns, so that you had more cows that weren't calving in the spring, which is when they naturally would calve. If you calve in early spring, then you're going to hit peak milk production 60 days later, roughly. And so part of it was lining that up and getting the price incentives right. But the other part was having processing facilities so that you could make the cheese and butter into storable products and keep them for later. And public policies at that point in time kind of were concerned about sanitary conditions, right? So this is a perishable product, and milk is if it's not kept in sanitary conditions, can be dangerous for consumers. And so dealing with that was kind of utmost concern to begin with. And then adequate supply having milk where people want to purchase it, so that when you go to the store, you can be certain that you're going to be able to get milk. And then the kind of third concern was income support. So how did we end up with these marketing orders that we have today? Well, the big reason was that the classified pricing and pooling from the co-ops was unable to achieve its goals as far as providing income support and making certain that there was what was called orderly marketing, which in a nutshell means that farmers are going to be able to find an outlet for the milk, and that consumers are going to be able to find the products that they want when they go to the store. And it was just what an economist would call the free rider problem was too big of a problem for the co-ops by themselves to overcome. Okay, so if half of the 3/4 of the farms belong to a co-op and the rest of them decide not to join the co-op, and the 3/4 because the 3/4 of the farms that belong to the co-op are operating balancing facilities that run full tilt in May and June to make butter, so that to take care of the spring flush, but then in, let's say, December and January are sitting idle. It's expensive to have those facilities, and it's cheaper if you can get by to let somebody else do that and not do it yourself. Also, if co-ops are bargaining for a milk price, but you have farmers that are not part of that co-op that can undercut them by a little bit and take the contract away, then you have that issue to deal with also. So then finally, really what the trigger was, which is the trigger to many of the ag policies that we still have today, was the Great Depression. Okay, so the Great Depression greatly damaged the co-ops financially, and obviously the farmers also. And so, Congress and the president were persuaded to enact the plan to kind of formally recognize the classified pricing and pooling that the co-ops have been trying to do themselves. And I'm not going to get into it. There was a 33 Act and a 35 Act that were kind of had some things that kind of had to get polished out. But ultimately, what we rely now on is the Ag Marketing Agreement Act of 1937, which is where the current set of orders that we have kind of come from as far as their origins. Importantly, you're not required to have a milk marketing order or any other type of marketing order. Let's be clear. I'm just going to talk about milk marketing orders today, but there are lots of other ag commodities that are sold through marketing orders, including, oranges and lemons. Michigan has a tart cherry marketing order. So there's, it's not just milk. That's the one we're going to talk about today. And then the milk one is pretty unique. But farmers only get an order if they ask for one. And so a majority of the farmers have to approve. And if they do, then the fluid milk processors will be regulated in that area, okay? It also, from 1937, it took well into the 60s before kind of the majority of the milk supply in the United States was priced under federal order. So it grew kind of slowly there for the first 3 decades.
Should get that out.
So federal milk marketing orders then regulate and supervise the terms of trade between farmers and processors. They set a minimum farm price level, and they determine the rules for how it gets priced. Again, back to the 37 Act. And we still have these today, but I'm going to tell you that you're going to see a lot of discussion in the next year and a half or 2 years, probably, about what needs to happen with federal milk marketing orders as far as are they operating the way we want them to today? Do they need a major reform? There's certainly going to be some people that are going to be advocating for doing away with them. And we can talk about that more later. It is something that's important to the farmers in Vermont, not just because they're part of a marketing order and surrounded by other ones, but also because if you're thinking about state policies, it's going to be built on and around these marketing order policies. And we can talk more about kind of the current set of dissatisfactions with that. If you want later, I'm happy to. My personal take on it is that the federal milk marketing orders get blamed for a lot of things that they were never intended to do. And I don't know that it's fair to blame something for not doing something it wasn't trying to do. But I certainly also think that there are some things that could be reformed and revised, and so that would be advisable in some ways. Oh. So again, milk marketing orders are regulations adopted with the consent of the dairy farmers to establish pricing terms and to offset the market power of the processors buying a perishable product using classified pricing and revenue pooling. Well, I've got more animation here than I thought. So the marketing areas are defined by fluid beverage milk distribution. And as we'll see, initially they were fairly small areas because they were for the local kind of distribution area, and the production technology, the processing technology, and the transportation technology did not allow the milk to go long distances. And then as we have kind of state and regional markets have grown over time, then the marketing orders themselves have also grown. They define minimum milk prices by class use, with class 1, which is the milk that goes into a bottle, usually being the highest price, although not always. Importantly, there have been some times when it wasn't. 2020 was most recent time when it kind of got out of line that way. And then the revenues from the different uses of class are shared by the producers supplying milk in that market by doing a weighted average of the different minimum class prices and assuring that farms are paid at least the weighted average blend price, with a couple of important caveats on that, which we'll talk about later. So the objective then, as stated in the milk marketing order legislation and in many hearings throughout the years, is to create market conditions that will ensure orderly marketing, which means essentially markets that, and this, by the way, gets argued about in some of the hearings also, what does orderly marketing mean? Markets that function smoothly, predictably, and at a reasonable cost. Seems like a reasonable definition. That's the one that I use. So again, that's farms being able to find a home for their milk and consumers being able to find the products when they go to the store, and that this happens at some reasonable cost. The general feeling is to want price stability. And I think, most producers and consumers would say that price stability is better than, price uncertainty. But that doesn't mean no variation, I would argue. We naturally are going to have some variation based on the seasonality, because production and consumption have counter seasonal peaks, right? Production peaks in the spring flush, and consumption of dairy products peaks during the holiday season. So, there's going to be naturally some variation. And so not necessarily no variation, but no uncertainty and maybe no unnecessary volatility, where the volatility is defined as kind of unpredictable variation. Third, that there's adequate, wholesome supplies of fluid milk. And this is something to remember. The federal milk marketing orders are primarily about fluid milk, about class 1. That's why they exist. If you talk to the Ag Marketing Service of USDA and you talk to the administrator, that's their primary concern. There's a whole lot of other milk that is involved in the federal milk marketing orders now that shares in the fluid kind of revenues, but primarily the orders themselves are concerned about adequate, wholesome supplies of beverage milk. And then finally, an equitable return to farmers. So we can have a price that varies some, but adequacy of the milk price is kind of a key aspect here. And then what does that mean over time, and how does that change with the structural change in the market is kind of a big deal that is leading to a lot of the uneasiness right now with federal milk marketing orders.
Bobby and Dan,
Yes,
Yes.
John.
could I ask just a quick question of Chris?
Absolutely. As far as I'm
Chris, I just wondered, since we're talking about the history of federal orders, was there ever a time when either consumer demand changed or science and technology developed something else to do with fluid milk, like when you can dehydrate it, or you can ultra pasteurize it, and how did the federal orders respond to that, or did they have to play catch up?
No, that's a good question. That's a fair question. So we'll get to the class definitions here in a little bit, but the class definitions are kind of broad, in the sense that the fluid milk means kind of pretty much anything that goes into a bottle, regardless of, at the consumer level here, right? So you are correct, right? Things have changed, like reverse osmosis. So if a co-op was going to ship milk a long ways and they weren't, one thing they might do is use reverse osmosis to take, half of the water out of 3/4 of the water before you put it in the truck, so you're hauling less water. But ultimately, what the orders are concerned with is how is it consumed. And so they have had to be concerned about what is defined by the different class uses and what is stuck where. Also, it's fair to ask whether the classes that we currently have defined are encouraging milk to always seek its highest value. There would be people that would say that they don't. And there would be certainly some anecdotal evidence that would be true. Another thing that people would say about the way we have the class prices defined is that they don't necessarily encourage innovation in products. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. I think the key thing to remember, though, is that they define minimum prices, right? So if you're going to bring in a new product, that you're going to create an innovation to bring a new product on, as long as you're going to get returns enough to pay the farmers at least the minimum price that they would have made if they were making, selling for butter or what have you, then you're okay, right? So you can be above it, not below it. In some sense, from an economics point of view, for having markets work, the problem with minimum prices, the problems are greater if you set them too high than if you set them too low. But it's a good question. And part of the reason that people would say we don't need orders anymore, the people that say that, is they would say, look, we've got technology now, we can, we've got the internet, we can move information around, we can line these contracts up and we can just do it without. We could. The shakeout of having no more orders would be pretty extreme. And I'm not certain everybody that says they don't want them anymore understands who the winners and losers would be if we went down that road. But anyway, I'm getting off track. So, the initial milk marketing orders, the first ones that were defined were, different places around the country. So St. Louis, Kansas City, Topeka. So, lots down in Missouri, Kansas, Dubuque, Iowa, Fall River, Massachusetts, in 1936, and then Boston, LaPorte, Indiana in 1937, and then New York City. You can see the different ones. So various places, but so by 1940, there were 20 federal milk marketing orders, but they were primarily in the Northeast and in the North Central, which is kind of our traditional dairy producing regions, right? So, we're thinking, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and then, Boston, Massachusetts, and areas around there. And then, states started kind of developing their own marketing orders that kind of started and stopped. So, and New York started one in 1933, but still has a part of the state, the Western New York one, which I'll talk about later. And 29 states then got involved in some dairy price regulation of some sort, and some of those are still going today, and some of them are newer, and some of them have gone away in the meantime. This is a scan of a map, which you can't read. But the point was, this is 1967. This is just an old map from AMS, and the different shaded areas are different marketing orders that existed in 1967. You'll see that Vermont has no shading there, right? New York does, Massachusetts does, at least some parts of Massachusetts, but nothing in Vermont there in 1967. This is 1981. You still can't read it, but you can see that we've got a lot more area that's kind of covered by the orders, and we've got maybe one county in southeast Vermont? Is that one county? It's hard for me to tell. You guys have, you guys know the state a lot better than I do, obviously.
It's in the middle of the state. It was up by White River Junction.
Okay. And so
One
you
plant.
can see that they, and then the existing areas that we have here, so they compare 67 to 81, we've got a lot more bigger ones, right? Defined now. So, you know, we've gone from like 5 different ones in Wisconsin to 2 different ones, for example, and things of that nature. So that they've kind of merged over time as the fluid markets expanded with technology and transportation. And by the way, the interstates had a lot to do with kind of the ability for this to change over time, for example. And then this is where we were, and I don't have the names out here, prior to the most recent reform. So this would have been, 99-ish. This is where we were for the milk marketing orders at that point.
What does the yellow mean, Chris?
Oh, sorry, these are just different orders. So the yellows weren't one. So for example, in Michigan, we had a Southern Michigan one and the Upper Peninsula one, for example. They were separate orders, but that didn't have anything to do with, and for, so they're just different orders. So all of the yellow ones here in the Northeast was one order. And then New York, New Jersey was, one order. But then,
Chris,
as part of kind of so good.
could you just go back to that slide for a minute?
Sure.
Just to highlight the point that Chris just said. Before 2000, New England, the yellow in New England, that was the one Boston order. New York, New Jersey was the New York order, and then below it is the Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So those were the 3 orders of most consequence for our region. I would just add, even though Vermont wasn't in the federal order itself, because the marketing area, there's not enough people here to really impact the order, but all of the milk was regulated anyway, because it went into Boston. So it's I'm sure you'll get into that later on, but
No, that's an excellent point to bring up. No, Dan, I appreciate that.
that's our market right there, those 3 orders.
The marketing orders, what marketing order you're in, or at least for that milk, and you could be in multiple ones depending on where you ship your milk, is based on where the plant that you deliver the milk to is. Okay. So for example, as Dan just said correctly, if you are in northern or any part of Vermont that's not shaded there, and the milk was going to the shaded region, maybe in Boston, right? Or the Boston area, then that milk would be pooled on that order. So for example, if you look at Missouri's a funny case here because it's got like 4 different orders at this time kind of impeding on it, but most of the state is white. Well, there's no processing plants in these white parts, so it didn't really matter. Also, that means, right, that if you were in Vermont and some of your milk was going to Massachusetts and some of it was going to New York, to the shaded parts, then you would have had milk on 2 different orders there. So it's based on where the milk is delivered to the plant at. So excellent point. So over time, as kind of the number of milk marketing orders grew, and it peaked at 83 different orders in the United States in 1962. So we went from, like 20 orders in 1940 to 83 orders in 1962. I've got a graph of that a little bit later. There was a lot of regionalization in milk marketing cooperatives where the smaller co-ops merged to form larger regional organizations. So we, ended up with Associated Milk Producers and Mid-American Milk Producers and Dairymen Inc. That were consolidations of other smaller co-ops in those areas. To the point where today, we have some regional co-ops, some state level co-ops, and even some national co-ops, like, Land O'Lakes is all over the country, and so is Dairy Farmers of America. In the early 60s, the basic driver in the federal orders was the basic price driver was converted to one reference price, which was what was called the MW, the Minnesota, Wisconsin. which was the price that the small cheese plants in Minnesota and Wisconsin were paying for grade B milk. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but all of the milk in the federal milk marketing orders is grade A milk, which means it's of fluid quality, because again, this whole thing is about beverage milk, at least to begin with. Okay, so grade B milk, right, is milk that doesn't necessarily meet the sanitation standards to be put into a bottle for drinking. So, but you can make cheese, or butter, or other things out of it. And they're, especially back in the 60s and 70s, were lots and lots of small cheese plants. There's still a relatively large amount of smaller cheese plants in Wisconsin, but not nearly as many as there used to be. It used to be every small town had a cheese plant, and you could survey these plants to see what they were paying. And the idea was that was a base milk price that was from a free market, because nobody was regulating grade B milk prices. And so we could take that price from the surveys of those Minnesota, Wisconsin plants and see what, and build the price for the class A, grade A milk off of that. And for many years, we used the Minnesota, Wisconsin price. Also, as kind of this grew across the country, we began to think of federal orders more as a coordinated system and kind of less as kind of independent marketing islands, which is what they kind of were to begin with. And that also had to do with the technology, the transportation, the processing, the growth, and the retailing, such that you could see that you could start to recognize some products as becoming more of a national market, like, for instance, butter. And so then in the 1990s, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, and some of it had to do with kind of disagreements across regions about the way things ought to work. The politics of federal milk marketing orders and dairy policy in general are always quite interesting, as far as how does California feel versus Wisconsin versus, New York and things of that nature. So there was a kind of a recognition that there needed to be a reform in the orders, and kind of view them more as a national system. And that happened with the federal order reform that took effect in 2000. And so here we are. This is actually not the map in 2000. I guess I should, first of all, let me be clear about that. In 2000, they went from, I don't know, 40 orders. Sorry, I forgot.
33.
33, that's what it was. Thank you. To 11. But at that point in time, if we were looking at the map, and I should have thrown up an old one, I guess, there would have been an order here in Utah, Nevada, and Idaho called the Mountain Order. That one was voted out by the producers in 2004. So for about 4 years, they had an order here in this part of the country. And California was not part of the federal milk marketing order system at that point in time, but is today part of it, and it has been since 2018. So this is the current set of orders. And right now we have 7 multiple component orders, of which the Northeast is one of them. So Northeast is Federal Order 1, which has got not Maine, but the rest of New England, and then most of New York. The western part of New York has the state order, part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and then down into Maryland and those states down there. So that's the Northeast. The Northeast, the Mideast, which is Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, a little bit of Pennsylvania down into Kentucky and West Virginia. That's the Mideast. Then we've got the Central, which is, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, South Dakota. And the Southwest, which is Texas, New Mexico, a little bit of Colorado, Pacific Northwest, Washington, a little bit of Idaho and Oregon, and California. Those are all multiple component orders, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later. And the other 4 orders, which is Appalachia, Florida, the Southeast, and Arizona, are skim fat orders, which just means that the components pricing mechanism is a little bit different. And I'll talk about what that is. Because ultimately, farms get paid based on it isn't really about the fluid milk that they sell. It's about how many pounds of butter fat and how many pounds of protein effectively did you sell. And that wasn't true by the way, before the federal order reform in 2000. It was before that, it was based just really on butter and butterfat price, and then everything else was assumed to be a residual, and kind of what they still kept in the skim fat orders. And the idea with going to multiple component pricing was that protein is very valuable. And so if we want to pay farmers more for producing high quality milk in terms of more protein, then we need to have that reflected. And that was part of the whole reform that went on at that point in time. So then this is the same map. It just, I've got some stars in here for where there's state regulation. Okay, so Maine has their own regulation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Western New York operates a state order that works in a complementary fashion to the Northeast order. Pennsylvania's got their own state regulation. Virginia, and then Nevada, Montana, and North Dakota do as well. And I don't think I've missed any, but Dan, you can pipe in if you know of any that I've missed.
Chris, an important part of what I see up there right now is we're basically surrounded by state orders. Am I right on that?
You are correct. Yes. But and we'll get to this later, and but they do some different things. So right, so the Western New York milk marketing order really, in a sense, just extends the Northeast kind of provisions out to the Western New York plants, whereas the Pennsylvania regulation does a little bit different things in terms of defining an overorder premium and even setting wholesale and retail price minimums. So so you are right, you are surrounded, but they do different things. But it's a good point.
But
Go ahead, Chris.
no, go ahead, Chris, keep going.
Okay. Okay, so then this is just shows you the number of markets, the number of milk marketing orders, which is the purple line, which is on the left-hand side vertical axis. So again, you know, we went up to 83 orders in 1962 and then kind of consolidated slowly over time until we went from 33 to 11 in 2000. And then 2004, the mountain one dropped out, and in 2018, California came in. But the growth in the amount of the percentage of milk that goes through federal milk marketing orders, it grew over time until we hit a peak kind of right before kind of consolidation. And then we kind of grew again here until the pandemic, and I don't have the numbers in after that. Actually, to be fair, this blue line would have gone back down because of the amount of depooling that's been going on, which is to say milk that doesn't have to participate in the order because it's, for example, going to a cheese plant or a butter plant where they decided to pull that milk out of the order because they could get more money outside the order, which is not primarily happening in the Northeast. It's primarily happening in the Southwest and California, and to some extent in the upper Midwest. And then if we look at, again, this is just a percentage of milk that goes through the federal milk marketing orders. If there was no depooling, we'd have more than 75% of the milk today going through the federal milk marketing orders, because California came in 2018. But again, a lot of that California milk is being depooled. Then the other thing that I would point out is that, for example, one thing that might jump out at you if you're thinking about the top dairy states in the country is that Idaho is the third largest milk producer in the country, and that they only have part of the kind of the panhandle up there regulated. But I would point out that all of the kind of milk that's sold in Idaho uses the Pacific Northwest as a reference price. So they are not in the order, but they certainly are, the milk is sold kind of in conjunction with or built off of the base that the milk marketing order price is defined. Okay, so even the milk that isn't part of the orders ends up sold in reference to them. So there's lots of ways that we could determine farm milk price. And one is to observe a market, which is what we did with the Minnesota-Wisconsin price series. And then the thinking was when we went through reform, and there was lots of debate about what to change to, or whether we needed to change back in 2000. But the thinking was really that there weren't enough grade B milk plants anymore to observe a free and fair market, and that wasn't necessarily reflective of the national market that we're talking about. And so, but maybe we could observe a different market. Chicago has spot markets. If you look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, you can see spot markets for butter. You can see cheese. And I'm not talking about futures markets, but those are also, you can observe those as well. And so maybe we could think about that. Those are very thinly traded. The futures market for class 3 milk on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is much less thinly traded. Class 4 is fairly thin, but we could think about something like that. We could think about whether there was some other place that we could observe a market that we could use as a base price. New Zealand has their global dairy trade. I don't know that we'd want to use that. I'm not advocating it, but that's something we could do. We could also figure out what the cost of production is, and kind of economically engineer the cost of production. We could observe it periodically, and then we could use price indices to adjust it, for fuel price changes and labor market changes and energy trade changes and things like that. So we could do that, and some countries do something along those lines. Part of the problem when you get into the cost of production is whose. And when we're thinking about dairy farms today, and we've got, dairy farms with a handful of cows, and we've got dairy farms that have, several thousand on one operation, and some of those farm families own multiple operations that have several thousand cows, then we end up with pretty wide variation sometimes in some of the costs. And so if depending on where we set it, that might be an issue, right? And then there's also product pricing, which is to say, which is where we ended up, which is let's look at what the products are actually selling for, and then we'll reverse engineer, if you will, what that means for farm milk prices. And that's where we ended up today.
Dan and Bobby, could I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Chris, going over this, I just wondered how do the different orders either coexist or compete with each other? So I'm thinking of my neighbor in Tunbridge. They were shipping with Horizon, or still are. Their milk is in, I guess, federal order number 1, but it was going out to Buffalo or possibly Virginia outside that order. So how Horizon would set a price, given that it wasn't, going to the exact region of federal order 1.
Well, so if it's being processed in the Northeast there, then the federal order 1 is going to be the one that it gets pooled on, possibly. Organic is a little bit of a different deal, right? In that organic has to travel a lot further because we have less of it. It's a smaller percentage of the market, and that's why it ends up being ultra pasteurized and moved around the country. And a lot of the organic milk production still takes place, like in the Northeast and in Wisconsin and smaller farms, right? Because the organic rules lend themselves in some ways to working on smaller farms, depending on the situation. So, but if we're thinking kind of bigger picture, the intention of the milk marketing orders, and we'll get into this with the class 1 differentials, is to encourage milk to flow to places that are deficit. So if you think about the Southeast part of the country, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, that part of the country is very much deficit in milk production. It's not the best place to milk cows, in the sense that a high producing dairy cow's thermal neutral temperature is about 50 degrees, depending on humidity. And so not really the best. So it's much better to produce cows where you have cooler weather, and also where you have access to forages right? So cooler weather and having some water is a good thing. But yet, right, you guys all know that a lot of the population growth in recent decades has taken place in the South and in the West. And so the way the orders are designed is to have higher prices in those areas to encourage milk if it needs to go from Vermont to head south. And a lot of milk does. If you look at those milk marketing orders, and every one of the milk marketing orders has a website with reports that show where the milk is coming from, you can see the different states where the milk is coming from, where the milk is pooled there. So if you look at the Florida one, you're going to see milk coming from Pennsylvania, coming from New York, and coming from other places in the Northeast that's headed that direction. So coordinating that way is an important part of what's going on here. So they pay a higher price for milk in those orders to encourage the milk to come that way. They also have transportation credits, which I wasn't going to get into here, which also helps offset some of the transportation costs for moving milk down there. So
Chris,
that's an important part of this whole discussion.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I as you were running through these last couple of slides, I looked up the pricing differences, and they're really significant.
Yes.
So it's interesting to then have you explain why. And just, I mean, it looked like recently maybe the Florida federal order was almost twice what the Northeast order is in terms of the basic price. I may be reading it wrong, but it looked like that level or order of magnitude.
The minimum difference is like I want to say it's in the $4.50-$5 range. I don't remember off the top of my head for Florida versus like the Northeast.
Yeah.
And then that's a minimum, right? So then they can be above that, and that's part of the whole deal is and as far as working right. I mean, I don't think you don't go any place in this country where you don't think, hey, if I go to the local grocery store, I'm not going to be able to find milk, right? So in that sense, it's working that way. So, and I will actually talk about those differentials here in a bit. So the basic functions in the marketing orders are to classify the milk according to use, to price according to class, which is to say what was it used for, to pool all of the qualifying milk. And there are standards that you have to meet to qualify a certain amount of percentage of the milk that has to be serving the market. And obviously has to qualify sanitation wise and things of that nature. And then the marketing orders and the market administrator audit these things. Okay, so the processors and the co-ops report to the market administrator about how much milk and where it went and for what use. And the market administrator audits these things. And from my perspective, that's one of the most useful things that happens from marketing orders is that they provide a base level of market information. Okay, so you have some idea of where the milk is going and how much of it's being used for different uses. And it also provides reference prices that everybody uses. And then coordinates across markets, as we kind of just talked about. And what that does is enhances the price at the farm level, provides some equity by pooling it, right? So prior to milk revenue pooling, it was possible, even if you had classified pricing, that the farmers that sold into the class 1 or the fluid market would end up with a higher farm milk price than their next door neighbor that was sending it to a cheese plant. So pooling it says we're going to take the weighted average and everybody has to be paid at least the weighted average. And then the auditing and coordination contributes to efficiency of milk flowing to where it needs to be consumed. Okay, so I've kind of waved my hands at this, but let's be a little more formal. Okay, classification assigns milk to a category based on what product it gets made into. So beverage products are always class 1, which is generally the highest price class. And it's meant to be. It isn't always, for some funny reasons that we'll talk about that have to do with some lags and stuff in the way we price it, but it's meant to be. Manufactured products, from skim milk powder to ice cream, have been over the years categorized sometimes into one manufacturing class and sometimes into as many as 8. And there's a we can have a discussion about what the proper number of classes are, and whether you think it should be more or less classes kind of depends on whether you're worried about vertical marketing power or horizontal marketing power. And by the way, one of the things that I think that you will hear discussed when we start talking about federal milk marketing order reform in the future is there's going to be people that say, well, let's just have two. Let's have one class for beverage milk and then manufacturing milk price. But that comes with its own complications. So class one price is the highest. And again, that goes back to being an inelastic demand. We're going to raise revenues for the farmers by raising the price, because even though that demand curve slopes down, it's steep. So that when we raise the price, a significant amount, we only lower the quantity a little bit. So you end up with more revenue. The other classes are lower, but the market still has to clear. Okay, so what ends up happening is we pay a little bit higher average or marginal revenue price to farmers. And so we end up with a little more milk. And if we're looking at a big picture, people that are drinking milk, everything else equal, end up paying a little bit more. And people that are consuming milk in the form of cheese and other things like that end up actually paying a little bit less than they would without orders. So since most people consume kind of both, it's probably not that far from a wash. But the winners are the manufactured dairy product consumers, and the losers are the beverage drinkers. Everything else equal. Which,
Hey, Chris, as I go to quite a few farm meetings, and sometimes the issue of pricing milk comes up, and farmers will ask, well, if I go buy a Chevrolet and my neighbor goes and buys a Cadillac, they pay the price for those two cars. But I bet, does General Motors get a different price? Do they have to pay a different price for the steel that goes into the Chevy or into the Cadillac? And so the question is, why aren't farmers paid a price for their milk, period? And the handler, whoever buys it, it's up to them to determine to get the highest and best price for the product that they're buying from the farmer.
yeah, well, and there are certainly other countries where that is the case, where there's kind of an average price assigned. And so I guess what I would say from that is, and actually whether you end up with a higher price, everything at the end of the day or not, kind of depends on what the elasticities are. And we can talk about how having a higher price for beverage milk results in less milk consumption, and maybe that's contributing to the decline in per capita milk consumption and things of that nature. But the idea is that if you look at the returns based on use, that historically, at least, the retailers were getting more returns out of that beverage milk than they were out of the milk that was storable and had more substitutes and like that in terms of butter and things of that. So that class differences were happening at retail anyway. So what this says is, let's extract some of that and pass it back to the farm level. So I think it's a fair point, but the idea here is that we're going to extract some of those class prices, but then we're going to pay everybody the same, because once we put it in the plant, we really don't know whether it came from Joe's farm or Jim's farm, right? So that's why we're going to pool it. I'm not certain if I answered your question or not, Senator Starr.
Well, I don't know if I'd be able to answer the question to the farmer with that, because, they all produce grade A milk, and some of it gets pumped into a tank and taken to a processing plant where it's made into powder. And that doesn't pay too good. And they don't have a choice over where their milk goes. It's up to the buyer of that milk.
That's true, but they also, because of the milk marketing orders, don't need to worry about competing for fluid contracts, right? So if their milk one day goes to be made into whole milk powder, that's okay. They're still going to get paid the average price because
Yeah.
of the milk marketing orders, right? So in that sense, it takes away the incentive to have a race to the bottom at the farm level for milk prices here, right? Because we have a reference price and we agree everybody needs to be paid at least the minimum price, and then we're going to average those. And then, by the way, if you're part of a co-op, they're going to get reblended depending on the co-op contracts and stuff like that. So what I'm talking about right now is just the milk marketing orders, but we will talk about the co-ops.
Chris, can I just ask a follow-up question to what Bobby just asked? And
Absolutely.
what you just said. So if a basic function of the federal orders was to try to prevent the race to the bottom, that both Bobby and I want our milk to be bought by a fluid milk plant because that would be the highest price, and not have our milk go to the powder plant because that was going to be the lowest price. So you create a price for each of those reflecting the market, and then pay us each the same price as an average to prevent that, right? But so that rationale made sense when the fluid usage in a market order was 60% class 1. So most of the milk went to the class 1 usage, but now the class 1 usage in the federal order, order 1 is 28%. It's gone down practically in half and is still declining. And the usage in class 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, 2 being yogurt and 3 being cheese, has gone up. So is it really that class 1 is now the highest value in the system? Do the economics of that, you don't have to get in, I guess it's mostly, are there economics that still support that milk being sold to a fluid milk plant is worth more than milk being sold to a yogurt plant?
That's a really good question, Dan. I think it's really more at the farm level about demand elasticities, and that is a research topic actually that I've been meaning to dig more into. The last time that I did work on that, the demand elasticity for beverage milk was like -0.3, and the demand elasticity for cheese was like -0.7. So they're both inelastic in that case. But it partly depends on the market you're talking about and the length of run you're talking about. And I think it's a fair question to say, do we want that kind of fluid demand elasticity driving the decisions, and are we still better off with the system we have now, basing everything off of class 1, right? And which I think is what you're asking. And
Yeah.
I think it's a fair question, and it needs to be kind of reassessed. And there's reasons to think that maybe that demand elasticity for beverage milk is getting more elastic over time because because of the plant-based beverages and other alternatives that some people view more as a substitute for dairy milk than what we used to have, right?
Yes. Yes.
I think it's a fair question.
But so the research is in your head, but you're not aware of if that's being done somewhere.
Well, yeah, it is. I'm just trying to think of the most recent. Every study that I'm aware of still comes up with the fluid milk being the most inelastic.
Still, okay.
But I think. But it's a fair question. Are we correctly handling the plant-based beverages and things like that in those studies? Is that what I think needs to be looked at more?
Okay. Thanks.
So, and it's one of those. I have a file drawer full of things of research. I'm going to retire long before I run out of things to do, which I guess is a good thing because I like my job. But all right, so who's regulated? If you're a class 1 processor, if you bottle milk, then you are regulated, unless you're very small. Okay, if you're a producer or processor of a small size, it's pretty small, then maybe you're not. But otherwise, if you're a class 1, if you're bottling fluid milk, then you are regulated in the marketing area corresponding to where you make most of your packaged milk sales. That means that the good news is, that the competitors are also going to be paying at least that minimum price. That But you also get advanced pricing, which is to say that we tell you what that minimum price is going to be a few weeks before you actually have to pay it. So that's kind of the trade-off. It's not true for manufactured milk prices where we tell them what the minimum is after that month is over. Okay, so the deal is if your HP Hood or your Deans or whatever, that we're going to tell you that you have to be participating in the milk marketing order, but we're going to let you know what you're going to be paying a little bit ahead of time. Manufacturers of other products may be regulated if they qualify, which means that they have to demonstrate service to class 1. There's a certain percentage of milk that has to be qualified on certain months, and how much and which months depends on the order. And the Northeast order has, relative to the other orders, fairly rigorous qualifying standards. And sometimes you'll see that there's a hearing where the Northeast order administrator holds a hearing because one of the maybe co-ops requested that they change the qualifying standards temporarily. And that might be because the co-op is having trouble meeting qualifying standards, but they want to still be able to pool their milk. And so you will see that sometimes. Why would they choose to be regulated? Because they get into that pool of dollars and they might receive an equalization payment. Okay, so the way it works by pooling it is that the fluid milk processors, if their price is the highest, pay into the pool. Okay, and then the cheese and other plants draw from the pool if their price is lower, so that everybody has the same amount of base money to pay their farmers. And they can pay them more than that, they just can't pay them less than that. So that's the equalization payment that you would be getting if you were, say, a cheese processor and you were in class 3 prices were lower. And if you're regulated, then you have to participate with the paperwork and the auditing, and you have to meet the performance standards and so on and so forth that go with the federal milk marketing order. So the key characteristics then the class prices is that they set the minimum. The prices can be above that, they just can't be below that. And an important distinction that I haven't really gotten into yet, but I'll just say it now, is that as far as the milk marketing orders are concerned, cooperatives and the farmers that are part of cooperatives are the same entity. So co-ops are paying themselves when they pay their farmers. So legally, they're not bound by these minimum prices. Okay. Whereas if I'm selling to, directly to Walmart, then, and they have a really big fluid processing plant, by the way, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. If I'm selling to them, Walmart is got to pay at least the minimum class 1 price for the Mideast order. Whereas if I'm selling to Dairy Farmers of America, just up the road, then not necessarily. But the thought was that the co-ops cannot consistently underpay what the investor-owned firms that are regulated are paying are. Otherwise, people would leave co-ops. Now, and historically, that's been true. We might have some discussions now, given how there's fewer places for you to market your milk if you're a farmer in most parts of the country, about whether that's still binding. And that's an important part of this discussion. But it's true that the minimum prices do not technically bind the co-ops. We also have component pricing in 7 of the orders. So it depends on what gets, how many pounds of butterfat and how many pounds of protein go into each of the different uses. So for example, skim milk is only 0.2% butterfat, right? Whereas whole milk is 3.25. So whole milk is sucking up more pounds of fat and skim milk is mostly just taking protein. The values get derived from wholesale product prices. And, we have price discrimination, which we've talked about multiple times. Some prices are announced in advance, which is to say the class 1 prices and one of the class 2 prices, and then others are not. And then we have location adjustments.
Chris, could I'm just maybe clarification. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
The co-ops, in some sense, are still bound by minimum pricing if they own a plant, right? So if DFA owns a fluid milk plant, they have to report to the market administrator that they are obligated to pay the class 1 price they're in effect a processor in that case. So they can't not pay the class one price. So they procure milk from their members. In our market, a Vermont Farms milk might be procured by DFA to go to a plant in Boston. That's a class one plant that DFA owns, and they have to pay the class one price for that milk.
Yes.
So there's the big distinction is, as the market has become vertically integrated, it's blurred a lot of the lines that used to be there, as you described before. The co-ops are not obligated on the one hand, but now they are. So just a point of clarification.
Sure. And over the long term, we would expect them to be doing that anyway. Nick, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think, one kind of parallel way of looking at this that's in my mind as we're going through this conversation is how did these various policy decisions around breaking milk into its components and then also coming up with systems of pricing and contracting with farmers, do those systems represent a sort of status quo or stability in terms of the pricing power of farmers, or do they represent a decline, or I guess, or an increase, although I doubt it's an increase. So do they represent an increase or decline in the pricing power of producers? And it's just interesting to think about how these choices are responses to sort of trying to regulate supply, regulate actually availability of milk to consumers on the one hand, but also what have the consequences been in terms of I'm really thinking about margin, real margin to farmers and what has happened there. I don't know if there's data that you have or a perspective that you have on what the net effect of these systems changes have been in terms of the margin to farmers in the Northeast. But I think that's one of the things that's driving this conversation for us. And maybe it's just a different way of asking the question that Senator Starr asked, on behalf of the farmers that he's in conversation with. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So I think that the federal milk marketing orders enhance the farm and the co-op, importantly, as a agent of the farmer, bargaining power more than they would without the marketing orders, in the sense that I think providing the reference prices, which are at least the minimum that has to be paid, and providing the market intelligence in terms of what goes where as far as quantities and from whom and what month and things like that. That's all very useful information. And so I think that in that sense, farms are better off than they would be without them. But it kind of depends a little bit on who you are and where you're at, as far as you could imagine that with no milk marketing orders, there would be winners and losers. My personal feeling is that when we think about structural change, as far as herd size increasing over time and consolidation of herds that goes along with that would happen at a much faster rate with no orders, especially in the short run. If they were to go away, you would see the retailers, the Walmarts of the world would rather deal with a handful of really big guys than they would with some small guys, is my personal feeling. But yeah, all good questions, and I think we'll talk a little more about that as we get into kind of some of the state policies and so on.
Great, thanks.
Chris, it's 10:30. Is this a good time for a
Sure.
break? Or is
Yeah,
there
we can-
somewhere-
Absolutely. If you want to stop now, we absolutely can.
Okay, so we reconvene in 15 minutes at 10:45.